well. We're very interested to share these ideas and to learn from other people what influence they might have on the curriculum and on the pedagogy. So we'll introduce these ideas to you, and I'll tell you a little bit about the origins of them as well. So this notion of living citizenship, to begin with, came out of a PhD study I did when I was deputy head at the school, and I set up a partnership with a black township school in South Africa. Lots of visits, lots of exchange visits and so on. And one of the things that struck me when I was there was the huge difference, of course, in resourcing, etc. We heard about that this morning, between schools. And I established a partnership at that time, and I studied the development of that partnership. And what the partnership for me threw up was that there were shared values that we in our school, as leaders of the partnership from our end, and the leaders of the partnership in South Africa, there were definitely shared values between us. And it struck me that that was so important in just being aware of those shared values. And it was those shared values that really drove the partnership. So the activities that we developed over the subsequent 10, 15 years of the partnership were driven by those shared values. And it just struck me how important those values were. And we came up with this notion of living citizenship as a way of sort of describing the process of living out one's values more fully through active engagement in citizenship activities. Now, we know about the notion of active citizenship, of course, that's a well-established principle. But we thought this was something slightly different. It's very much based around the notion of values. So the values that underpinned our partnership, we decided were social justice, humanity, equal opportunities, and then the African notion, which some of you may be aware of, Ubuntu, which is a sort of care for humanity type of togetherness approach. So these were the values that drove the partnership forward. And during my PhD, I was able to provide evidence of how these values had influenced the activities of the partnership. And there is a link to that on the handout. It struck me this morning, listening to Gary's introduction, that particularly the reference he made to the new focus on the quality of education and the relevance of learning on what children, youth and adults are actually learning. It struck me that maybe these sorts of ideas would be something to consider in that respect. Moving on, our second notion was this idea of cultural empathy. Stephen Coombs, Jack and I considered this notion, and we developed this value called cultural empathy. And we think it's about understanding different cultural contexts and celebrating difference. And as our partnership celebrated our cultural differences through art, through music, through dance, and so on, I recognised this as a feature of the partnership, in that we shared values that crossed cultural boundaries and acted as a basis for moving the activities of the partnership forward. So cultural empathy, I think, goes beyond mere study. It's something that needs to be acted on and experienced by those engaged with a dynamic curriculum. And then, putting those two values together, we came up with this notion of living global citizenship, which you can see we've tried to define on that slide. And basically it brings together this notion of living out one's values as an active citizen, but also having a global perspective at the same time. So the cultural empathy idea being part of that. So it's about participation by learners in a cross-community project which enables a more living or immersive educational experience, and one that develops cultural empathy. And one of the things we've recently done is to just sort of try and tease out what the opposite of that might be. So if we think of cultural disempathy, and how that's manifested, perhaps we see a lot of that in the current debate around join or leave, remain or leave, and so on. There's an awful lot, I think, of exploration that could go on in terms of looking at what that cultural disempathy means and how that would be realised through a global future. And for me, that's quite a concern. So I think this notion of cultural empathy is something that is very important and needs to underpin a lot of the pedagogy that we deliver. So, the notion of living global citizenship, I leave with you just to consider in terms of how it might inform our curricula. As we've developed these notions, we feel that we need to live out these values, of course. And what I'm going to do now is just show you one or two examples of people who are living out these values in the work that they do and in the research that they're carrying out. So the first slide here is a lady called Arianna Briganti. And Arianna is working as a development economist in various countries, and she states her commitment to tackling sustainable development from the perspective of those at the receiving end of aid. So while she's carrying out her work, she's researching her own practice using a methodology called living educational theory that strengthens her ability to contribute to the establishment of the human capabilities of the people she works with in developing countries. And this is how she views cultural empathy in her everyday life and in the work that she does. Now, our next example is from Stephen Coombs and Madhumita Bhattacharya, who have both been involved as well in the development of these ideas. And what I've got here is a short clip from the two of them. They've worked in a number of higher education settings around the world, currently in Dubai. And here they present their understanding of the notions of living global citizenship and cultural empathy, and how they've informed their practice. So just a couple of minutes video clip here.
I'd like to introduce Professor Madhumita Bhattacharya here.
Hello, and here is Professor Stephen Coombs.
Thank you, and what we're going to do is give you a couple of case study examples of our own sort of experiences of, living global citizenship in action in various educational settings we've had around the world, and we're going to start with Mita's example.
We will give one example each to extend the idea of cultural empathy and how it links to global citizenship. My example would be when I was working as a visiting professor at the University of Tartu. We had a video conferencing session with students from University of Botswana. They were all postgraduate students, and the Botswana group was all African men, and the Estonian students were mostly women. They were doing a group activity which we kept very flexible for them to choose any approach they would like to have. And in that we saw a distinct difference between these groups. The group in Botswana, they were put the problem on the table and working to solve that together. They were divided in small groups in both the countries. And the Estonian group were actually individually solving the problem and then looking at each other's work. In this, we have learned something, as well as also found that how students have learned from each other, different ways of working. Botswana students, obviously, they were more confident when they were presenting their findings. But Estonian students were not that confident because they did individually and there was no coherence in their presentation. But at the end, learning was similar, I would say, because they have also learned from the Botswana students, those who were solving the same problem from a different cultural perspective. So I also learned through that in internationalizing curriculum means also meeting the needs of different cultural groups and the way they work. And also we have to think about not only developing the curriculum, but how you deliver it. And that is also important. And now we switch to Steve's example.
Yeah, so just summarising what Lisa was saying, it seems that a very flexible approach, being very open to the different cultural context and allowing people to, sort of use and apply their own values in terms of, sort of solving problems, working together, and really sort of taking a sort of backward step in terms of allowing that sort of situation to occur and then bringing together the ideas.
And that is very much important in higher education, because
time. I'm just going to stop it there. I'm conscious of time. But so what we have there is, with Ariana and Stephen and Madam Rita, is examples of people who are living out these values and learning about these values as they practice their everyday work. So, having said there are people living out these values in the way they operate, I think also we're keen to think about applications for the curriculum. So, what would a living global citizenship curriculum look like? Well, I think it's one in which the participants engage with and develop a sense of cultural empathy through the activities that they engage in. So activities such as participation in exchange visits, just as it began with me, that sort of international exchange, gives them an opportunity to focus on cross-cultural community experiences. The focus, though, not only on economic poverty, but also on examining and confronting issues of injustice and power relations. So those partnerships negotiate their terms of reference through jointly identifying and articulating the shared values of importance to all the participants. And those shared values then drive the activities of the partnership. Secondly, smart uses of technology to encourage partnership and the sharing of information, and again this notion of cultural empathy. And finally, possibly new types of professional development for teachers involved in international curricula. So I'll hand over to Jack now to talk a little bit about further on the use of technology.
Next slide, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, how long have we got? Just
2 minutes.
2 minutes. 2 minutes, okay. 2 minutes. Very quickly. One of the things that I'd like to draw your attention to is what Gary was saying about the what difference are you making? What difference am I making? And in that, the I is absolutely central. What difference am I making? Now, all of our titles, including our own, omit the I. And what I want to show you is where you can access the action research practitioner researcher accounts for master's and doctoral degrees, where people around the world have got their doctorates from answering those kind of I questions with values that carry hope for the flourishing of humanity. So that idea of the living citizenship is right at the heart of these doctorates, and I just want to show you where you can access them. If you remember, actionresearch.net, just remember that, and you can go into it, and you can actually get at these papers that are in the recent issue of the Educational Journal of Living Theories, which actually published last week papers from somebody who got her doctorate here, Swaroop Rawal, that some of you know. She's been doing all of this work in India, in Gujarat, looking at the questions of how do I improve my practice. And the I is absolutely central to it, but it's also linked in nationally with what is happening in the Indian context. So it puts together with my question to Gary earlier, do you remember that, about practically what difference are you and I making, and then actually advocating that we do engage in small-scale studies on our own practice to show how we're living those values as fully as we can. And in relation to living global citizenship, if you get into the Educational Journal of Living Theories, that one there, it's okay. And in particular, this one on the living theories, and you won't be able to read this, but these have just gone through from the University of Kathmandu. It's all about creating living educational theory towards transformative teacher education practice in Pakistan. This one from the University of Malaya in terms of continuous practice improvement in a global profession. And these are at the top, and if you go down the list, you'll see that the I, actually how do I evolve, you'll see that the I does come into a lot of these doctoral theses. So that, I think, is my 2 minutes. Is that?
Thank you. Just to say to everybody, if you have got links and slides you wish to share, if you can email them to me, I will make sure that everybody gets a copy of those links and slides on. Okay, open up to questions. Any questions?
Yeah, just a question for Jack, really, in terms of the living education theory, and particularly around that whole idea of global citizenship and the value of the I. Do you think there's also a really important value of the we and what we do collectively as communities of practice? practice within that.
Yeah, I really do. The notion of Ubuntu, I am because we are, is really at the heart of a lot of our work. But also, don't forget that we are because I am. You know, if I wasn't here today, if you weren't here today, the we would be different. And I've always found it very difficult to use we unless I've got everybody's agreement that I have permissions to use the we, because so many we's are imposed. So I think that's very important to get the collective, but also to keep the individual I together. Yeah.
Thank you.
Can you tell me why it's not the difference and why it's not then self-studying?
I helped to found the self-study movement in America in 1993. Now, the difference between generating your own living theory and self-study is that a living education theory is a self-study. But in self-study, you've no requirement to produce a valid explanation of your influence in your own learning and the learning of others, as well as the social formation in which you're living. So, living education theory is always a self-study, but it actually goes further, I think, in requiring a valid explanation, evidence-based, of your educational influence. But I do think self-study is that vital, as is action research, narrative inquiry, and autoethnography. I think you can bring all of these into your study of your own practice. Okay. It's okay.
Nicola.
No, I was just really interested in the concepts of living citizenship, cultural empathy equals living global citizenship, and it reminds me of some other concepts I've been looking at myself, which were, it's just the sort of idea of intercultural competence plus citizenship equaling becoming intercultural citizens, which is building on, it's actually Mike Byro who's been developing this idea of intercultural citizenship.
Right.
I think there's an article by Jane Jackson who also talks about cosmopolitan intercultural citizenship. And I think it's really similar.
Sounds like.
Yeah. So.
I'll be interested to talk to you further about that. Yeah.
Thank you. One last question. Okay, thank you so much. It's great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice.